மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Well, we're going to start the examination of our repertoire by dealing with the modern variation, which, let's face it, is the most common choice for white at virtually all levels of play. Well, white contents himself with the move 4 knight f3, as stated before, very modest, and I wouldn't say an ambitious way to tackle the opening. I would say this is a very sensible approach by white. And now I'm going to recommend the move d takes e5, and after knight takes e5 for black to play c6, and this is what I will dub the Miles variation, named after the British Grandmaster Tony Miles, who in my view did more to popularise this position, this variation at Grandmaster level than anyone else. And we're going to kick off by looking at one of his games, and this is from the European Championship in the year 2000, and he's playing Karel van der Wiede from Holland. But before I get stuck into this game, I often wonder in this position why white didn't go d takes e5. I mean, if you look at all the theory books, you'll see knight takes e5 almost exclusively. But, you know, occasionally you're going to come up against an opponent, and particularly somebody who doesn't know anything about this at all, who might venture d takes e5. So, and it's interesting, the complete absence of theory on this line. I mean, is it so easy for black to equalise against this move? So I think it's worthwhile taking a couple of minutes right at the start to actually examine this move and actually see what black should do. Well, what should black try? Let's just see, is white really threatening the move c4 in this position? Now, I think bishop g4 is actually a pretty good move in this position. The idea of that is that if white plays c4, black is going to play knight to b4. Queen takes d8, check. King takes d8, and now black has two threats in this position. Knight c2, check is obviously a very dangerous threat. Bishop takes f3, enfeebles white's pawn structure. So if white doesn't want to get a lousy game right at the outset, he's got to try the sharp move knight g5 in my view. This is the best. After that, I think bishop h5 is most modest. White's got to come round to defending the threat of knight to c2. Now I think black should play pawn to h6, and then when the knight goes back to h3, play the sharp and interesting move g5. This does two things. It keeps the knight on h3 firmly out of play, and it also, to a certain extent, artificially isolates the pawn on e5, which could be vulnerable to hits such as bishop g7 and knight 8 to c6. And now, however white plays in this position, I think probably bishop d2 is his most accurate choice. Black gets counterplay with knight 8 to c6. You know, black has obvious counterplay in this position. The fact that the queens are off doesn't really mean very much. The fact that the king is in the middle, if the queens are off, makes black's life relatively comfortable. I think the main feature of this position for me is the weakness of white's e-pawn. Now, just dropping back to the position after bishop g4, of course, white is under no obligation whatsoever to play c4. For instance, you might be asking, well, why doesn't he play h3 in this position? Well, again, after that, I think black should keep things relatively simple. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, e6, again with visions of knight b4 if white plays c4. For instance, if white plays c4 now, he could find himself in a terrible mess already after knight b4. There are echoes of another Alekhine variation here. White is actually in quite a bit of trouble there. So after e6, just going back, perhaps a better move is bishop to d2. Then black plays knight to d7, attacking the e-pawn. Very common feature of this particular small line. And after queen g3, black can play the sharp move h5 with counterplay. Now, you're not going to encounter this line very often, but when you do, it's useful to have at least something prepared. So I hope this small amount of analysis gives you some idea of what black should be doing after the very uncommon move d takes e5. Bishop g4, in my view, is the best shot. But what was noticeable about that, of course, is that in most of those lines, white was ceding the initiative to black almost straight away. The pressure that black was able to create against the pawn on e5 gave black a pretty active game, and most whites, of course, will be very reluctant to do that because they feel that the initiative is theirs as of right in the opening. And so knight takes e5 is an attempt to maintain the initiative and to use the advanced knight to put pressure on black's position. And now we play the move pawn to c6. Okay, so as stated, black is trying to find the best way of preparing the move knight to d7. And now white obviously has a large choice. We're going to focus on a couple of games at the start using the move bishop c4. I don't know whether you can call that the most common move in this position, but it's certainly one of the most logical. If white puts his bishop on e2 or d3, these moves have their strengths and weaknesses. c4 is quite an active square. It doesn't block the e-file. White's simply preparing the moves castles and rook e1. So we can't really argue too much with this choice. And now knight to d7, which was almost always Miles's choice at this juncture, challenging the knight. And now the knight went back to f3. We saw a game Weatherly versus Benjamin in the introduction where the same idea was played. If white basically wants to get anything at all in this position, he's got to keep the pieces on. The idea is with more space, you cramp the other guy by keeping the pieces on. So knight f3 is by far the most logical move for white. I mean, there were some Miles games where white took on d7. But in general, they were games where the lower rated player had white and was satisfied with a quiet and even rather dull game. For instance, the game Cao Sang versus Miles, Vietnamese Grandmaster. They're played in Ohrid 2001. After bishop takes d7, white castled, black played bishop to f5, and now white played just simply bishop to d3. Well, I mean, there's not a great deal you can do if the guy plays like that. And Miles was very content to get an equal game after bishop takes d3 and then following up with e6. I mean, in a way, the position resembles the Alekhine, but in it, or even the French, but in a much better format for black because a couple of pairs of minor pieces have been exchanged, and of course this makes the defence very easy. I mean, just take play on this game, Cao Sang versus Miles, for a couple more moves just to show you how easy it is to defend. White played c4, black brought the knight back. White manoeuvred his knight around to f3. Basically, this is just a very dull position where white has only a nominal advantage in space. And now it's really a question of where black puts his major pieces. Well, queen c7 looks like a good post. And now how would it be if black centralised the rooks? Queen came back to e2. Rook fe8. Maybe white was threatening d5 at some moment, so the rook carefully protects the bishop. Bishop to c3, and the two players agreed a draw in this position. It's basically a very, very solid way to play for black if white takes on d7. So going back to knight d7, knight f3 would be the choice of most ambitious players. And now knight 7 to b6, which I believe is the best move here. It's a bit strange that black is able to put his queen's knight on b6 in this particular variation, but the main idea in playing knight b6 at this stage is to use the exposed position of white's bishop to enable black to develop his own bishop on c8. In my view, this is the most comfortable choice for black in this particular position. And now black envisages initially light squared play. He's developed his bishop actively, and then e6 will follow, followed by bishop e7. All his pieces are out. It's coherent development that black is focusing on right now. All right, well, knight bd2 was played, pawn up to e6, nothing spectacular there. White castles, black plays bishop e7, anyone can play these moves. And now white plays a small hit on the bishop. Well, there's no need for black to surrender the two bishops at this stage. May as well keep the knight in a pin. So bishop h5 was a comfortable choice. And now white played c3. Black castles. Knight comes to e4, perhaps intending knight g3. So bishop comes back to g6 straight away. And now Miles brings his knight back from b6 to d7. Rook e1, and now pawn up to a5. a4. Just dropping back. Why did White do that? Well, I think if he didn't, Black would probably play a4 himself and exchange off the light square bishops. This helps to cement the position of the knight on d5. If White wants to get rid of that knight, he has to play c4. And if that happens, then White has to accept certain weaknesses. If the light square bishops are off, the knight could come to b4, and White's d4 pawn could become weak. So I think a5 is actually a pretty good move. And this position kind of sums things up from a theoretical point of view. Black is perfectly okay after a4 and has comfortable play. The rest of this game is a very tough struggle in which Miles eventually comes out on top. So let's just see how Black manages to win from what appears to be a rather quiet position. So rook e8. Comfortable and accurate defence. Bishop comes back to c4. Queen comes to c7. This seems to be a decent post for the black queen, with ample control of an important diagonal. And now White brings his bishop out to g5. In many ways this position resembles similar structures from the Scandinavian and the Caro-Kann. And it's well known in these structures that White is eventually looking to occupy the d6 square. I know this seems a long way off, but White would very much like to put that knight on d6. How is he going to engineer that? Well, I think the first stage in that process is to exchange off the dark square bishops. After that, hopefully, White can put his knight in on e5. The pressure created by putting that knight on e5 will probably force Black to take. And when Black takes, White recaptures with a pawn, after which eventually the knight will get to d6. What are the obstacles to White's plan in this particular position? Well, first thing is it takes a heck of a long time to organise. Secondly, Black can just snap off that knight on e4 whenever he feels like it. If he feels like it, he can wait. And thirdly, I don't think after h6, sorry, Black took on g5 first, knight eg5. I don't think after h6, White is in any position to effect that plan. So, despite the fact the knight came back to e4, Black is able to cope in comfort by playing rook a d8. White can't even play knight e5 in this position. So there's a lot of juggling to do before White can to get any sort of plan into practice. In fact, I would say, if I had to choose between the two positions, that Black has slightly the preferable chances in this position. Importantly, he's got the f4 square. That's a nice square for either his knight or his queen. He's got the usual breaks to consider with either c5 or e5, but of course they will require patience. And the queenside pawn structure also favours Black slightly. I mean, Black quite likes the idea of his pawn on a dark square vis-a-vis White's pawn on a light square. You could argue that in certain endings that's going to make the White bishop bad. And that's true. It's only a small thing, but it is something. So there are certain features of the position which mitigate in Black's favour, I would say. Rook a d8. All right, rook a d1. Probably the objective evaluation of this position is about equal. Comfortable for both sides. Knight 5 to b6. Bishop b3. And now, hey presto, Black found a good moment to play his freeing pawn break. Knight g3. Well, I mean, the first reaction in this position is to take on e5. And just let's see what happens if White does so. D takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes d8, getting rid of any liabilities on the d file. Queen takes d8, knight takes e5, rook takes e5. Well, I mean, White would have loved to have done this if he could have done, but there are certain problems on the e-file. White can't play knight f6 check, Black takes, and his rook is protected. And otherwise, he's in quite a nasty pin there. There are residual problems on the e-file. White would have liked to have done this, but, you know, clearly he saw in his mind's eye that the position that arose was going to be very uncomfortable for him. It may be even that white is losing material in this position. So I think we can safely append an exclamation mark to e5. Miles timed that break correctly. And so white played knight g3, hoping to, in turn, embarrass black on the e-file. But Miles was up to the task, and e4 was played. So black is, for the first time in this game, starting to think about taking over the initiative. Knight comes to h4. No way does black want to surrender that bishop, so bishop comes back to h7. And now white creates a twin threat with queen h5. He's not only threatening the pawn at f7, he's threatening queen takes a5 as well. Miles has got it all under control and plays knight f6. The idea being that after queen takes a5, black has rook a8. And at this juncture, perhaps van der Riede saw that Miles had actually analysed quite a long way into this position. Because, well, in the game, white played queen c5. If he plays queen b4, protecting his pawn on a4, the idea is that black plays knight fd5. The white queen is trapped, apart from bishop takes d5. Then comes knight takes d5, queen b3, and now perhaps the move that white missed when he went in for this, the cute queen f4. This highlights how important the f4 square is for black in this position, and well, the knight on h4 is simply dropping off the board. So that is completely out from white's point of view. Hence, queen c5. Okay, fair enough. Knight takes a4, and the upshot is that black has regained his pawn. With interest, I would say. Okay, well, b2 is attacked. White decided to take it. Didn't want to even think about that threat anymore. And put a knight in on f5. I mean, you have to say that this is logical play. The knight on h4 could be completely out of play the longer the game goes on, so it seems wise to get it back into the game. Miles took the knight and played his rook up to e6. Still a very tough struggle. But again, if you were pushed to choose a position, you would have to say that black has slightly the better chances here because of his more active rooks. So rook e6. Now white played b4. My own view is that this is a mistake. But just going back, isn't it true to say that black is threatening b6 himself in this position? It's a bit surprising, you know, that the white queen is trapped. And maybe white has to go into full-scale retreat with moves such as knight e3 in this position. Things like that, but that's a hard move to have to play. I think van der Riede decided to lead from the front in this position with b4. The idea is that when he goes b6, he can retreat with queen c4. Well, Miles was happy with this. He played b5. Queen came back to b3, not queen to c5, because then, well, the queen is lacking a retreat square. So queen to b3. Knight comes to d5. Here we see black taking over the game. You know, he's got all his pieces entrenched on excellent squares. That knight can't be shifted. The rook on a4 looks pretty strong. Queen f4 is in the wings. Now white played knight e3. Queen came to d7. Rook a1. And now rook g6 was a good move. Threatening queen takes h3 with horrible mating threats. And that's a threat that white can't ignore. King h1. Knight came to f4. It was probably very surprising to white. Again, it's one of these Alekhine games where the game turns on its head very quickly, and white is left wondering how it possibly could have happened. He seemed to have a decent game. There seemed to be not an enormous amount going on. Suddenly, black whips up chances from nowhere, and in fact, in this position, he has numerous threats. He's got threats of sacrifices on h3. He's got a threat to take on g2. This is really quite unpleasant already. King h2. Perhaps white should have put his king there in the first place. Point is, of course, if white goes rook g1 to try and defend the position, knight takes h3 is a bone crusher. Just winning material. So king h2 was played, but after that, rook takes g2 check concluded matters. And, well, it really is quite simple. If knight takes g2, queen takes h3 check, king g1, queen takes g2 mate. So ample demonstration there of black's chances in this variation. We'll go on to look at another game now where something similar happens. But for the time being, let's just reflect on black's opening play. After 6 bishop c4, knight d7 immediately seems like a pretty reasonable move.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. தேங்க்யூ.